Welcome, everyone. My name is Miriam Wright, and I'm a professor in the history department at the University of Windsor. Before we begin, we'd like to first acknowledge that the land that the university sits on is the traditional territory of the Three Fires Confederacy, the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations, as well as the Attawandaron and Wyandot nations. Um, I'm a member of the Propeller Project who is hosting this event today. Propeller Project is a collective whose aim is to foster research through art and art through research. And to help us explore this question today, we invited Dr. Stephen High, who is a professor of history at Concordia University. I actually met Stephen over 20 years ago when we were both postdoctoral fellows at Memorial University in St. John's, which is actually where I am right now. And in the years since, Stephen's work has explored many topics, including working class communities and post-industrial transformations in North America, transnational labor and migration, oral history, and public history. He is a co-founder and was the co-director of the Center for Oral History and Digital Storytelling, which is now considered a world leader in the field of oral history. A highly collaborative scholar with a strong commitment to community engagement, Dr. High has also been an innovator in research creation methodologies, particularly through the Montreal Life Stories Project, which he will be discussing today. Dr. High has received multiple awards for his work, and most recent is the Governor General's History Award for Popular Media, also known as the Pierre Berton Award. His talk today is entitled Going Public with the Montreal Life Stories Project, Oral History as Research Creation. Now, the format is Dr. High is going to be speaking for about 30 minutes or so, 30 to 45 minutes. And after that, we'll have a question and answer session, and I'll talk to you then about how we can do that. Okay, Stephen, welcome.
Well, thanks so much, Miriam, and thank you for that very nice introduction. I'm just going to share my screen and share the right thing. Everyone can see the photo, huh? Okay. Okay, well, thank you so much for this invitation. This kind of cross-disciplinary and cross-faculty initiative, like the Propeller Project, is close to my heart, and it's at the core of our practice here at Concordia's Center for Oral History and Digital Storytelling. We regularly tether our courses across disciplines in overlapping time slots so that students in theater, art education, art history, and other disciplines can work across disciplinary boundaries. I've also co-taught courses with theater and other disciplines where students learn oral history practice in the first term, and then we explore ways of performing those stories in the second term. History students, I think to their horror, were required to dance and perform alongside the theater students. There's considerable value in my experience in this kind of experimentation. I'm therefore keen to learn more about what you're doing at the University of Windsor and how we might collaborate in future years. My talk today focuses on how, when, and with whom we go public in our research creation practice. I will ground my comments in the Montreal Life Stories Project, a 6-year Social Science and Humanities Research Council funded partnership, which recorded the life stories of 500 Montrealers displaced by war, genocide, and other human rights violations. These are people who experienced mass violence and forced migration and who now live in Montreal. The slideshow that I'm sharing records our work together thanks to photographer David Ward, who was a full co-researcher in our project. His still photography beautifully captures collaboration in action. The project began with 40 team members, evenly divided between university-based researchers from a broad range of disciplines and community co-applicants from 17 partner organizations. These were mainly volunteer groups, so they had day jobs from the city's Rwandan, Cambodian, Haitian, and Jewish communities, though it also included educational, arts, and heritage institutions, so the National Film Board, the school boards, and so on. In time, the project grew to more than 300 people as community members, artists, and students streamed into the project. Many were young people from survivor communities who had their own questions, as there was and is a great deal of silence within families and within communities. From the outset, we agreed that everyone in the project would participate in the interviewing. We all wanted to sort of feel it and to sort of avoid these hierarchies that sometimes get developed. Team members interviewed their parents, grandparents, other members of their cultural communities. We had university people interview community people, and vice versa, because we had a fair number of Rwandan, Haitian, Cambodian, and Jewish professors who themselves had experienced mass violence. Now, each of these constellations produced different kinds of conversations, not better, not worse, just different. Like if I interviewed my mother and you interviewed my mother, they wouldn't be the same interview. This diversity is one of the great strengths of the project. From the start, we believed that collection was not enough. Montreal Life Stories therefore sought to integrate these stories into online digital stories. So again, with the National Film Board, instead of reaching in and taking out a story that spoke to us, we asked interviewees, okay, you've been interviewed for 5 or 10 hours. Which story do you want to share with the world in 4 minutes? And their choices were very interesting. So we had digital stories, we had art installations, audio walks where you hear what was and you see what is, and then also the effort to try to reground global stories in the local. So thinking about Montreal's relationship to Rwanda in 1994, it's over there, it's back then. How can we reduce that distance and find connection? We had radio programming, both live, a live weekly radio programming, plus a radio production shop, animated film, pedagogical materials, an immersive bus tour. Now, bus tours are often terrible things. You're in there and someone's going blah, 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 and pointing out here and blah, blah, blah. And the idea with that project was to transform the bus into an immersive storytelling space, around the stories of refugee youth. And then it was anchored at different places in the city that were meaningful. We had intergenerational conversations within different cultural communities, but also conversations across between different survivor communities. 400 Metro cars were equipped with audio portraits where you can listen to people's stories. We had a year-long museum exhibition. And we had theatrical performances of all kinds, ranging from playback theater to gestural theater, sound theater, youth theater, and a full-scale professional theater play. In each instance, we sought to use oral history interviews and life stories as catalysts for personal reflection, public dialogue, and political action. University research ethics in Canada, as elsewhere, I think, is premised on the idea that we can regulate the interaction between two groups of people, the researchers over here and the researched over there. And there's all the space in between these two groups. In true collaboration, however, these old lines blur as you start to have blended teams, you start collaborating over the course of a project. And stories are actually being shared in all kinds of contexts, be it meetings, performances on radio, and so forth. The recorded interview may be the most regulated space in qualitative research, but it is not the only space where stories are being shared. What is on and off the record becomes unclear. It was a unique project for a number of reasons. but mostly because survivor communities were co-creators of the project and served as co-directors and co-researchers, and they were usually found on both sides of the project's video cameras. We wanted to reimagine the research creation process, learning with communities instead of simply learning about them. At its best, this change, this shifting perspective, this shifting approach, represents a fundamental shift in the politics of academic production. In my experience, oral history naturally lends itself to an approach grounded in knowing with. Oral history is a field of research, teaching, archival collection, community building, truth and reconciliation, and artistic practice emerged with the diffusion of the tape recorder in the 1960s and 70s. This was also a time of enormous social and political upheaval. As a result, oral history was quickly taken up by feminists, working class and queer activists, racial minorities, and other marginalized people who sought to record the hidden stories that would be otherwise lost. Many people's stories never make it into so-called public archives. These radical origins have profoundly shaped the field. Yet, unlike ethnography, which is the disciplinary practice of anthropology, oral history has never found a secure home in our universities. It has had an uncomfortable relationship with the history discipline in particular. Now, there are a number of reasons for this. Historians study the past, not the present. Even today, we, and I include myself there because I'm a historian, we generally direct our students to actively suppress the present by writing in the third person and the past tense. In these ways, historians distance ourselves from our objects of study. With distance comes clarity. At least this is the old disciplinary logic. Now, of course, that's changing, and the work of Miriam Wright and many, many others are really challenging these structures that still shape and define, how historians do their work. Oral history has a very different modus operandi. Oral history is fundamentally about the relationship between the past and the present, placing memory front and center. At their best, interviews place experiential authority. So this is the authority of, I was there and I'm going to tell you what really happened. That's a strong authority. Put that into conversation with expert authority, people who bring some questions, maybe some training and distance. This approach to learning across or listening and learning across difference and in dialogue represents a not so subtle shift from learning about to learning with. These differences in orientation are such that until recently, there were few oral history courses offered in university history departments. Most oral historians, including myself, are therefore largely self-taught. The good news is that the marginality of oral history in the academy has meant that it has emerged as a diverse community of practice. Oral historians can be found across the university campus. What's more, most people who self-identify as oral historians are found off campus in the communities that they belong to and serve. They are teachers and artists, archivists, social activists, museum professionals, and community members. This diversity means that oral history is much more than a research methodology. It has become a space of creative exchange and experimentation, a place of mutual encounter. Much like teaching, there is no one way to approach oral history interviewing. I've come to think of the interview as a mixed method. The most common approach is the life story interview, where the conversation unfolds roughly chronologically, and there's a lot of time travel. There's a lot of movements, across time and space in an interview as you explore all kinds of connections. Now, this was the approach taken in the Montreal Life Stories Project, as we sought to understand the experience of mass violence in relation to the time before and the time after. Only then we realize, could we fully understand what was lost and how the impact of violence rippled outward through people's lives and even across generations. Rwanda in 1994 did not begin and end in those devastating 100 days of genocide, but remains very much present today in the lives of so many people. In fact, their lives as survivors began once the violence actually ended. Our approach to interviewing struck a balance between intentionality. We had some core questions, and as a project had identified a space that we wanted to explore, that we thought important it was to explore, and flexibility. We understood that our interviewees also had a space they wanted to explore, and that space might be very different from what we thought was important at the beginning. And I often find that the spaces, that interviewees take us to are actually far more interesting and important. The key, and I think this is true of collaborative research generally, is time. Taking the time needed to explore it all, to have a sustained conversation. It takes time to build rapport and trust. Some stories surface slowly. Our default was therefore multi-session interviews that were as long as 20 hours in total each. So these are really long conversations. I think the average was closer to 5 hours per interview. We also built in a great deal of reflexivity into our process. I think this is important. All of our interviewers, which was everyone in the project, we wanted everyone to experience, these stories firsthand and to be involved in the interviewing process. All the interviewers had to complete a 5-hour training workshop at the beginning, which spoke a lot or emphasized a lot about the importance of listening, and how most questions being asked should really be follow-up questions, because that's an act of listening. If you just ask, a rigid sort of question 1, question 2, question 3, an interviewee, a survivor doesn't know if you're really listening. You could be a robot. But also respecting silence, right? Sometimes there's a tendency to fill the silence too quickly. And so we spent a lot of time working with people on how to work with silence and how to listen. But we also thought about emotion, and what do you do when emotions start to flow or tears start to flow? Do you turn the recording device off in fear that it becomes voyeuristic to actually be recording someone, who is in distress? Or by doing that, are you actually telling people that emotions don't belong here? Or do you just let it go, right? You let the recording device continue. And so, as a project, we decided that that the interviewees control that recording device. They decide when it's turned on and turned off. And so you would invite people, right, at a certain point, and ask them. And often people say it's okay, and then that allows them to make an adjustment. Interviewers also had to share reflection with the rest of the project within 48 hours of each session. We therefore have nearly 1,000 of these written reflections, an incredible archive of feeling and interpretation. And I think in any kind of project, one of the challenges is how to share all that learning that happens in each of these kinds of spaces, these project spaces. And there's so much learning that goes on in an interview. How do you share that, with others, and how do you document it? And I think this is important. We also organized regular debriefing sessions so interviewers could share their experiences. Interviewees were also invited to join the project, participating in playback theater workshops or becoming, in many cases, interviewers themselves. And I'd be happy to speak more about this work in the question and answer period. So during Montreal Life Stories, I came to think of oral history as a creative practice, open to adaptation and experimentation, not unlike, I think, the propeller analogy that you have adopted in Windsor. Now, with this context in mind, the rest of my presentation is inspired by a book that I co-authored with Liz Miller, a filmmaker, and Ted Little, a theater artist, called Going Public, The Art of Participatory Practice, which has an accompanying website at goingpublicproject.org. Now, Liz, Ted, and I worked closely together during the 6-year Montreal Life Stories Project. And at the end of this project, we had a lot of questions about how others have approached community engaged or community university research. We were particularly interested in how researchers and artists go public and the place of the originating community, so the communities where these stories and these people come from, what their role is in that research or creative process. Over the next 2 or 3 years, we interviewed researchers and artists from around the world about their collaborative practice. And so many of these interviews are available on our web platform. Now, with this project, we sought to create a space of mutual reflection with seasoned practitioners across disciplines about core challenges and the potential of new technologies and methodologies. To Go Public Toronto filmmaker Kat Cizik told us, means an openness that we're not doing things private in closed rooms. As Montreal area documentary theater maker Annabelle Sutar told us, ideas get stronger as they're bounced back and forth between different minds. There is growing interest in the creative tussle that can happen when you're working outside of your comfort zone. Several practitioners went so far as to refer to themselves as media or methodological agnostics. This is not coincidental. The willingness to be open to new ideas, tools, media, methods, and relationships is a fundamental part of any collaborative endeavor that crosses disciplinary or cultural boundaries. For some, this produced a certain tension between their willingness to try new things and the closed nature of disciplinary authority and identity. Within universities, there has been a strong public turn in recent years that is rekindling interest in multimedia knowledge production, new kinds of cross-disciplinary alliances, and participatory approaches to research creation. The development of cross-disciplinary methodologies such as photo voice, digital storytelling, community mapping, participatory media, and other arts-based approaches on the one hand, and the emergence of new public subdisciplines in traditional sort of social science and humanities disciplines such as history, geography, sociology, folklore, archaeology on the other, reflect a deep-seated desire to rethink how and why we do research creation, with whom and for whom. One of the questions that we constantly asked ourselves and continue to ask is, what do we mean by public? Whose public are we speaking to? Publics are not only multiple and contested, but the public sphere itself is based on exclusions. This work is particularly challenging when publics are entrenched in long-term conflicts. Speaking to her work with Israeli and Palestinian populations through Just Vision, Ronit Avni spoke of how she has used film as a strategy to foster dialogue. Quote, "It's difficult when you're coming into a context where people have very different, very deeply held convictions on an issue to change their frame in any way. And we don't always succeed, but we try to create complex media about particular issues that challenge people's frames and then give them a forum to hash out the complexities and the difficulties of the issue so they can really digest it, grapple with it, think about it." Clearly, there's a sense of collective fatigue and demoralization in the Israeli-Palestinian context that leaves people with the sense that there's nothing to be done. To counter this, Ronit Avni has sought to shift attention away from the usual hateful or fearful voices heard in the media and towards those everyday people working to bridge the divide and find a nonviolent resolution. She had a lot to say about the role that digital media can play in addressing bystandership. Avni feels that bystanders are very, very accountable for what happens in the world in ways that we don't necessarily want to think about and recognize. According to her, if you can get past the ways that people deny and deflect information that would implicate them as bystanders, to do something and get involved, then you're onto something. There are many bystanders on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, but no more than on economic inequality, industrial restructuring, systemic racism, homelessness, and a myriad of other issues plaguing our society. The pressing concern is how to activate people. The impulse to go public, both during the research process and thereafter, rests on the idea that participation empowers individuals and their communities. This speaks to a deep-seated belief that connecting with audiences at an emotional level will somehow activate them, making them care. For example, the presumption that audiences can be emotionally moved to remember or to act is the driving force behind the large survivor testimony projects of the past quarter century. But there is also some debate if these projects do, as hoped, activate listeners. We simply don't know much about the impact of personal story sharing projects or even how people listen to them. More research is urgently needed. Too often, I fear that people's stories are shared as an illustrative device, a little emotional salsa added for a touch of flavor, or to help authenticate the opinion of outsiders. Julie Salverson, who comes from a theater context, has raised troubling questions about the naive solicitation of personal accounts, which may recycle scripts of melancholic loss and reproduce a form of cultural colonialism that is, at the very least, voyeuristic. For Lisa Taylor, a professor of education at Bishop's University, voracious empathy risks being an exercise in emotional tourism, an ahistorical, sentimentalized, and romanticized feeling good about feeling bad. For her part, Indigenous scholar Eve Tuck has raised important questions about damage-centered research and its long-term impact when marginalized people are treated as broken or as a problem, in effect reducing them to the pain and hurt they have experienced. The politics of the work we do is therefore of crucial importance. That said, I do believe South African oral historian Sean Field is right when he suggests that sharing stories can, over time, contribute to social regeneration in the aftermath of mass violence or in the context of societal rupture. And so in the context of rupture, you have, the ties, the social ties that bound get torn apart. So how do you reconnect socially? How do you begin that process? A growing number of storytelling projects are designed to work across these social and political divides. Working as the first NFB, National Film Board Artist in Residence, Kat Cizik has used technology to bridge divides, interviewing healthcare professionals and their youthful patients separately. And they say nasty things about each other. And they would never say that if they're in the same room. They'd be too polite probably. And so the idea is that she interviews these people separately, and then she plays it back. And so you hear sort of the other's perspective in a way that's maybe more direct, right, than you would in person. Another example is the Prison's Memory Archive in Northern Ireland, which curates the stories of both sides of that conflict in such a way as you only know which side of the political line you are on when you actually start listening to a story. So the stories aren't labeled, here are Republicans and here are loyalists. These are people, and it's only when you start to listen that you can start to locate. And so the idea is, how do you listen across difference? How do you listen to people who you normally, don't listen to, don't want to listen to, can't listen to? Here in Montreal, Annabelle Soutar has developed an expertise and passion for using theatrical art to present divergent opinions. I quote, "Fundamental to our work is this idea that it's important to people who think and feel very differently or have very different life experiences to share a stage together, and that for audiences, it's great for them to practice that critical muscle in their brain to see the different points of view and make some sense out of them together." That sounds pretty good. And yet, this multivocal approach has also got Soutar into trouble. Her recent play, Freddie, based on the life story of Freddie Villanova, a young Dominican man shot and killed by the police in Montreal North, was deeply collaborative. Soutar worked closely with the Villanova family. However, she also staged the stories of the officers who shot Freddie, humanizing them as well. The family was outraged and withdrew their support of the play. Soutar incorporated their criticism into the play, but continued to stage the story. It reminds us of the importance of ethics and clarity in the initial consent process. These attempts to bridge power relationships and controversies raise interesting issues about the relationship between what Rowan Avni calls asymmetrical power and the desire to engage with personal stories. So I'm going to share with you a short video clip of 2 minutes of the interview with Rowan Avni where she speaks about this. Just a sec. So this is the Going Public website. It's goingpublicproject.org, where you could listen to a number of people talk about, the work they do. And so one of the people is Rowan Avni.
I think our understanding of,
Miriam, can you hear the,
of how societies in
Yeah, it's
Miriam,
good.
You can?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
conflict behave informs all of the choices that we make. So for example, when you have a situation of two populations in conflict, and in this case, it's not two symmetric populations, it's an asymmetric dynamic. People tend to have a very romanticized self-perception and a very demonized perception of the other in any conflict situation. Where you have an asymmetric conflict situation, the group that's in power has a tendency to want to get to know the other as a person, not to talk politics, to really humanize and recognize the humanity of the other, and then maybe over time, after trust building, deal with the political. Whereas the structurally disempowered group says, look, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if you're a nice guy or not. If I'm in a situation where I'm facing structural oppression, your personality is irrelevant. We need to be working on the structures that are creating this asymmetry. Those are very different approaches to interactions. The expectations are different. The call for action is different. One population may be looking for dialogue. The other one may be looking for nonviolent resistance. They're expressions like coexistence versus co-resistance. And if you have an awareness of that, you can structure your engagement in such a way that you're not ignoring the needs of the populations that you're looking to reach. So on the one hand, you don't want to turn every individual into a representative of their dominant group and dehumanize them so that they lose their individuality and their agency. On the other hand, you don't want to ignore the structural realities that are creating this situation and that are keeping a population from having the fulfillment of their rights and their freedoms. And so that is something that is part of all of the work that we do, the recognition simultaneously of individual agency and structural inequities that need to be addressed. And I think that having that experience and that analysis helps us to structure the way that we tackle this problem on a daily basis.
So central to virtually all these conversations was a shared sense of urgency to rethink our capacity to take our work public as artists and researchers. The resulting conversations resonate with our shared concern with the ethics and efficacy of going public as a method of shifting power. Clearly, participatory research creation also raises important questions about ethical practice. How do collaborative projects share authority or control throughout the research creation process? What are the ethical and political imperatives for those entrusted with another person's story? How do and how might oral history, theater, and community-engaged arts contribute to public knowledge and to healthy and sustainable relationships? And ultimately, is going public always the right thing to do? Much depends on how we go about doing what we do and who is in the research creation process. There's a growing recognition that collaborative models of doing research need to be extended beyond the fieldwork phase. So I want to share with you another project that is really on these lines. This is the Living Archives of Rwandan Exiles and Genocide Survivors in Canada. So it was a follow-up project. So the Montreal Life Stories Project had many children and grandchildren, right? So it had many sort of other kinds of projects that flowed out of it. And this was one. This was a partnership between PAJ Rwanda, which represents the families of survivors, Rwandan genocide survivors in Montreal, and our Oral History Center. And so the idea was, how do we curate life stories online? Now, it's quite rare to actually find full interviews online. Usually what you get are small excerpts, right? Little bits that have been curated, have been selected for you. And so what we wanted to do was to put entire interviews online, allowing people to actually listen, through this long form, right? Someone's story before, during, and after. And to realize also that these people aren't reduced just to the pain and suffering that they experienced in 1994. There's a lot of love and life and joy, even laughter in these interviews, but also pain and hardship. And so we tethered the interviews to transcripts, which allow us to sort of search the interviews and to enter these stories in a variety of ways. We also developed a series of tools that allow us to sort of engage with these stories in new ways. I think increasingly qualitative researchers and others want to sort of engage with stories, individual interview, a corpus of interviews, different ways of entering the story, of hearing these stories. And so, for example, we worked with a group of computer scientists to develop a new tool that allows us to sort of think about the interview as a conversational narrative, that it is, it's structured, it's very structured as questions and answers, right? So that interviewer and their presence, that interviewer, is very important. And so this is a tool that allows us to identify moments where there is dissonance, right? Where there's hesitation, deflection, or even disagreement between the interviewer and interviewee, where the interviewer, maybe it's inviting the interviewee to come into this part of their life, and the interview, oh, I don't want to go there, right? Or I want to take you over here, right? And so it allows us to think about this dialogic, right? This back and forth, right, in the interview. I think that has value. Another tool that we've developed was led by Sebastian Picard. He's a cyber geographer. And so it's a way of entering interviews through maps, right, to geolocate the stories and these trajectories, and to sort of think about people's relationship to geography, right, the different kinds of relationships, whether it's around violence or family. And so it's a new tool that has been developed, that is continuing to be developed, and it's actually down today because they're putting up a new version, and I was going to show it to you. So I can't show it to you, so I got the static page, but if you normally go to this page and you press Atlas CNA, you'll be able to see the atlas, which has been developed. And with that atlas, it's really interesting because, again, it's not just listening to each individual interview, it's actually listening to a whole, these 29 interviews that we have online. I can go on and give you all kinds of other examples of the sort of cross-disciplinary connections that we've been forging. I do a lot of work with people in literature, or oral literature, people who are, interested in the spoken word, in poetry readings, who are really interested in orality itself, and how do you think about sort of the spoken word, like the spoken in the spoken word, and how do we start to begin to analyze the voice, and also people really thinking about embodiment, and people like Sandeep Agwadi, who are thinking about the gestural repertoire. Like in Montreal Life Stories, he developed a whole, mini project where he was, they were studying these interviews, and they were realizing that bodies remember, that when people remember back to, say, 1930s Poland, that their body language changed, right, to that historical cultural context, right? And so anyways, and so he's built up theater plays, which is really about sort of this embodied memory. And I think there's a lot there that we can work with and think about. I think I'll end it there. I want to make sure I've gone over time, and we need to have a little bit of time for questions and answers. So Miriam, do you want to, sorry for going too long.
Oh, no problem. Hey, thanks so much. That was really wonderful. Now I'm going to invite people to ask questions, and so you have the option of either typing your questions into the chat function, or if you want to raise your hand, we'll try and catch that and let you speak directly. So yeah, so way to go.
I can ask a question to start. So thanks so much for the talk, Stephen. I'm just wondering, can you tell us the different kinds of disseminations that you did, and speak a little bit about the responses you got? So in terms of which kinds of forms of dissemination had the most people as an audience, and then maybe which kinds had maybe the most robust response? Thanks.
Yeah, I think I've come to think of, I think it's really important in a process to have multiple outcomes, and not to think about like a universalized public or a unitary public, that different outcomes, reach different people. And what you want is a variety of outcomes, a variety of public engagements, right? And by having that plurality, it also allows, for wider authorship. Which I think is really, really crucial. Like, who authors in a collaborative project is the ultimate test. And so in our project, again, like earlier I mentioned, and you saw in the images, a wide range of public and public spaces that were created. I think probably the most sustained, like most biggest impact, I think, was within survivor communities themselves, right? That there were spaces, like public spaces, that were opened up within, say, the Cambodian community where there hadn't been a conversation around the Khmer Rouge. And a lot of young people, you know, had a lot of questions, right, around their family's sort of place in that history. And so there was a breaking of silence, right? And so I think within the communities there was a lot of movement, and was even transformational, I'd say, in certain contexts. I think another key point was like some of these spaces, these public spaces that the project created, allow different survivor communities to see and talk to each other, right? So like the Rwandan community organized an intergenerational conversation one year where they had, it was an all-day event, and they had curated the digital stories. So, you know, they divided the day into 3, and you would watch 20 minutes of digital story drawn from the interviews. There's a panel of elders who would sort of reflect on what they just watched, and there would be questions and answers. And then the next panel, and the third panel was a panel of young people. But over the course of the day, you know, everyone had these small memory cards. They're very colorful, you know, cards, and they were invited to write, you know, a date and a memory. And what they had done was on the front wall, they put like 1945 until today every year. And so over the course of the day, everyone went up to the front and pinned their personal story into that collective space, right? And it was, to me, a beautiful example of community regeneration, I guess, or community building. Because of course, this community was, you know, like some were in Rwanda in 1994, some were not, some were born after, you know, some were politically in different contexts. There's also the Hutu-Tutsi divide. And so anyway, so the Cambodian community saw that. And then the next year they organized something. So I think that's where I think where it was strongest. Now we also, you know, I think pedagogically, I think we opened up spaces, so we embedded courses into the project in a real way. And so students, you know, I think had a real opportunity. Now we also had the desire, you know, to occupy a bit of the public sphere in a context where there are politically problematic debates around reasonable accommodation, and this line that's drawn between us and them and here and there, you know. And so we wanted to challenge that. We wanted to sort of say, well, you know, these stories are our stories now, and to think of Montreal or think of Quebec, we need to open things up. And that's a harder thing, right? Yes, we had press conferences, we had lots of media, you know, we had assemblies in 20 high schools, you know. There's all kinds of ways that we reached out, but did we did we change things? Did we have a political impact in a city that as large as Montreal that resonated beyond? That's a harder thing for me to say for certain. So I'm not sure that answers your question. But.
We've got one question on the chat, and someone is asking about why Montreal? Why not any other city? Why did you choose Montreal?
Yeah, well, we're in Montreal. and actually, it's a great question, because we made a decision that everyone in the project had to be in Montreal. And so all the researchers, all the artists, you know, all the interviewees, all were in Montreal. And so the project's, you know, Montreal Life Stories, you know, in a way, Montreal is sort of an even playing field. Like, we're all Montrealers, and we all have a life story. And the longer name of the project is like Life Stories of Montrealers Displaced by War, Genocide, and Other Human Rights Violations. And so what I like about Montreal Life Stories too is it's not pigeonholing people. Like, we want people to define themselves. So not every person who experienced genocide would self-identify as being a survivor, right? Some would maybe self-identify as being a refugee or an immigrant you know, or an exile, or none of the above. And so we wanted people to identify themselves, right, to define themselves and how people understood their experience and, you know, from their own point of view. So the Montreal thing was important. And the other thing I would say about Montreal in the Quebec context is that Quebec and Canada are very politicized in terms of the national question and so on, right? It's like picking a side. Whereas in a way, Montreal is a bit of a safe haven. It's sort of between those two things, right? And it's a space where diversity and plurality is actually something that's accepted, whereas it's not always accepted in the other two, right? Even in the Canadian context, it's, you know, say it's like mirrored bilingualism. So you don't encounter French because you're either French and you're on this side and you get everything as French, and you're English, everything's English, right? You don't actually have to encounter the other, right? Whereas Montreal, it's like Propeller, right? It's all mixed up, and that's the beauty of Montreal, and that's what makes Montreal a great city. So it's really just proximity, to answer that question.
And we've got a question from Michelle MacArthur, who says, thanks very much for the talk. She says, I'm wondering if you can speak a little more about how you used playback theater in the Montreal Life Stories Project.
So Nisha Sajdani, who was sort of the head of that, she's now head of drama therapy at NYU. But she was the head of Creative Encounters, which was a private, like, NGO kind of thing. And they had a playback. So playback, for those of you who don't know playback, it comes out of drama therapy, and the idea is, you can imagine like a workshop environment. And the idea is that the conversation, like someone stands up and shares a story. And usually it's a heartfelt story. And you have this troupe of players, and you saw some pictures in the slideshow, who then play back that story through, you know, embodied action or sculpture, right? And then that person responds, right? So it's this sort of back and forth. And so at the beginning, you know, like, so they have a troupe and they're embedded in the project. And so the question at the beginning was, what was its relationship to the communities, you know, through the interviewing and so on. And so, so what they did over the course of the 6 years was organized playback sessions within each of the cultural communities. So amongst, you know, first and second generation Holocaust survivors, for example, or within the Rwandan community, Haitian community around the earthquake. So that was, you know, it happened during the project, or even like amongst interviewers as a debriefing session, right? Where we would share our interview stories. And it became a really effective space for reflection, right? And I found that the stories that emerged in that space were very different than the stories that emerged in a Life Stories interview. So I've really come to think that, you know, like different spaces lead to different kinds of stories emerging, right? So what you want in a process is a diversity of spaces, right? Just like you want a diversity of outcomes to reach different people and create different kinds of conversations. So playback became really, really quite important for the project as a whole. And they published a lot. They have a lot of articles and publications. And the other thing I'd say is that what was sort of interesting is because of this blending, right? That even with publications of like multi-authorship, right? So you have collaboration right into, you know, the writing of like, what did you learn? What was that all about? And so you have a lot of, you know, a lot of publications that are sort of conversational narratives in a way, like are structured conversationally, where you have multiple perspectives. Like usually when we write in history, it'd be like a single author would just be, you know, the author argues, or if you have multiple authors, it would be we argue this, right? It's rare to actually write where you actually show difference, you know, different sort of positionalities of your your interview, of your authoring team. And so at our conferences and stuff, you had all kinds of, so you had these sessions where be part presentation of academic paper, and then, and then they would split off into like performance or into music, or trying to break that fourth wall with the audience. And so there's a lot of playfulness around the form of sort of research and creation or arts-based stuff. And I think that kind of experimentation is to me really vital and brings to life, and allows for curiosity and so on, playfulness too. Yeah.
I've got a question here. What made you wish to get on board with this project? Was there a defining moment?
Yeah. Well, I think, the crucial is the first step. Like in any collaborative project, it has to be envisioned together. If you envision a project, then invite people in, you're inviting people to participate in your project, right? So that first phase is really important. That's where the frames are sort of built, or the structures are developed. And so we spent, 6 months, meeting to envision a project, and it made sense, for all of us. I'm from Thunder Bay, Ontario. I'm from a working class background. I never interviewed a genocide survivor until I actually joined this project, or helped develop this project, and so, but it was about Montreal. I think it was the imprint in Montreal that really was important, and I think oral history as a field was a natural connection, right, to do this.
Okay. Are there any other questions?
I have another question. I was really interested when you were talking about how different the answer was depending on the context that you were asking it, who was asking it, maybe how, if it's somebody within the culture you're comfortable with, or you were talking about interviewing your mother, how different that would be. How has that made you think differently about archives, and maybe in terms also of all your labor history work that you've done, your more traditional history writing? What do you think about when you think of the archive, and how, like, not only the whole dialogue about how few voices get into the archive and it's only certain voices, but then the flavor of how much those voices were even shaped. So basically, how has this made you think differently about the archive?
Well, at one level, I'm not the same historian I was so long ago when I was doing my postdoc with Miriam. I've been changed by this experience, but I think in terms of archive, it's made me realize that to understand, you have to understand context, right? There's the context of the interview. So who's in that room matters. So we had people interview a parent, that it may or may not be obvious if you just listen to it, right? But that's why those reflections are really important. By having those written reflections, it adds to your understanding of what's being said and what's not being said in that interview. And then the wider project context matters too. So in archiving, often in oral history, it's like, okay, we'll archive just the interviews, but actually I think we need to archive more, right? We need to document and record that wider conversation, that wider context. And that's true of any project. Yeah, and so the interviews are crucial, right? But so is everything sort of around it, crucial too. Yeah.
Okay, good. I think we have time for maybe just 2 quick questions. We've got 2 last questions here. I'll give them to you both and you can answer them at the same time. One is, someone is asking, how do you plan to move forward in oral history? And John Conlon is asking, he says the project was so ambitious, how much of this was set down prior, and how much did the project take on a life of its own?
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, maybe I'll start with the second question. So it's emergent research, right? So of course, like we had set foundations, right? But I do think that a living process needs to evolve. And so, for example, like the influx of so many young people into the project changed the project. So suddenly intergenerational issues became really central, right, to what we were thinking about. It wasn't really even visible in our application for the original grant. Again, I just like the interview, it's that balance between intentionality and flexibility. I think a good project does the same thing, right? That you have a purpose, you have a direction, right? There's a compass there, but that you evolve, and that you explore, you experiment. It's not just random, right? There's a purpose. And so just like in that interview, I think for us that was how we sort of approached it. And this sort of core sort of concept of sharing authority, which is a concept that's used quite a bit in oral history, this idea of the value of sort of, you know, a dialogic of learning with, right, back and forth. And so we were constantly thinking about how do we push that, you know, through the process, right? You know, how can we, you know, and we're constantly asked, like, you know, who's this for, and so on. And then who's around the table, like so we had parity. So on all governing bodies, you know, there was half community-based people, half university. Our hiring policies were very much anchored in the communities that we were working with. So there wasn't this massive cultural divide between, you know, university and community, which you have too often, which makes things, you know, problematic. So, and the second question, so this project had many children and grandchildren, and including real ones, relationships, not my one, but I got married before, but there were others. And so, and of course, I think one of the really interesting sort of legacies is that a lot of these cultural communities continue to work together. So there's a rotating exhibition at the Holocaust Museum in town, where the Rwandan, Haitian, Cambodian communities, and Jewish communities have this rotating exhibit every 3 months, and this has been going on ever since, right? And they've had inter-community conversations, like, you know, they call them focus groups, but so it laid a foundation for work that is no longer sort of involved, where the university is no longer part of it. I think that's great that we help build a capacity within the communities to do this kind of deep memory work, that they're not dependent just on, you know, the grant or a professor, and so on. And so we have our oral history center too, which has helped. So again, you know, so all these children and grandchildren, you know, the project ones are, you know, in French you say encadré, so they're supported by our oral history center. And I think it's really important that communities, we often talk about community engagement, and we often think in terms of profs going out into the community. But I think it's as important, or even more important, that there are pathways into the university for communities, right? And spaces where they can leverage or get support, resources, and so on for the work that's important to them. And so our oral history center, you know, has been doing that. And I think we have 300 affiliates, and half of them are community based. And so I think, and I think that really, it's also a gift to every student and faculty member, in the sense that we, you know, a more diverse conversation, you know, allows us to make different kinds of sort of connections in our minds and in our work and our creative practice.
Okay, good. Well, thank you so much. It's been really wonderful. And I encourage people to follow up, check out Dr. Hai's website and the websites that he was talking about. You can explore more about what he was talking about today. And get in touch with us if you have any questions or have trouble finding them.
It's a
Okay,
pleasure, Miriam. Thanks to everybody. I can't see
great.
you.
No, great. Thanks very much.
Bye.
All right. And I guess we'll reconvene in,
Yeah, you said at 4, right? So
yeah, at 4. So we'll
okay, I'll be
catch
there.
you back. Okay, great. Thanks.
Bye.
See ya. Bye.